I've actually been looking for a video like this, one that explains the take on natural rights specifically as used by libertarianism. This is a bit of an older video, but I don't think that much has really changed since it was made, since the modern philosophical underpinnings for natural rights dates back to the 1700s. I'm going to point out how a lot of libertarians use these ideas to try to justify their political platform, but I'm also going to show some of the fundamental flaws that underlie a lot of modern philosophical thought, although I'm going to do a much more expanded video in the future. So here we go.
The concept of natural rights, as first introduced by Locke, essentially sets up a deontological set of moral rules for certain actions which, when ends are sought, the means are inherently immoral, regardless of the ultimate consequence.
Okay, I don't know why I'm bringing this up, but does this guy think he's Napoleon or something? He spends the whole video with his hand in his jacket. Yeah, maybe there's a reason, but it just kind of struck me as an odd thing to do. Anyway, I'm going to get to the meat of the issue. He explains that Locke, a philosopher that lived from 1632 to 1704, set up a series of ethical and moral rules, the end results of which are natural rights that simply exist for everyone, all the time, and in all places. Well, I'm sorry, but I wholly reject this concept, and I don't think that Locke or Hobbes or Thomas Paine or any of the other philosophers that libertarians hold out have really demonstrated their cases, but we will get to that.
So, for example, the non-aggression principle set up today is an extrapolation of Locke's understanding of natural rights. The idea being, and this is held in many extreme right deontological libertarian crowds, that aggression in a physical and coercive sense is inherently wrong, and any action that includes it, either the use or threatening of it, is an inherently immoral action and should never be taken.
And that sounds great, but at the beginning he argues that Locke has an understanding of natural rights, but that's something that's never been demonstrated. They claim these rights exist, just magically floating around out there in the ether. They've just never actually proven them to exist in any objective manner. They pretend they exist and use them as an axiom, but in a debate, axioms are only allowed if all parties agree that they are accurate and valid. I do not. I've seen the same kind of thing in theological debates, where the theists try to slip in the existence of God as axiomatic, meaning they're going to assume the existence of God rather than actually demonstrating the existence of God, as the debate almost always certainly demands. I couldn't walk into a debate on the existence of unicorns and announce that I'm simply going to assume that unicorns exist and therefore I win. Libertarians don't get to do that either. If they're going to posit the existence of these natural rights, things that exist a priori without any evidence, then they are going to have to expect to be challenged.
Now, the only exception to this, as far as the non-aggression principle is concerned, is if one defends themselves, which is why the concept of what property belongs to which person becomes very important, because who is the victim and who is the aggressor in any given circumstance is dependent on who owns the thing that is being coercively disputed over. As a result, these natural rights theorists have also set up a long list of ways in which one ethically obtains property, by which the universe somehow decrees that they have a moral right to that thing. There's such theories have been set up, such as homesteading for land, and it all initially derives from Locke's understanding of how it is that things, without will, are owned by people.
Interestingly, he seems to think, and maybe this is just his language that suggests this, but I've seen a lot of libertarians do the same thing. He seems to think that there is some godlike entity or force in the universe, however you want to define it, that grants these rights and decrees these ideas. When you get down to property ownership, there isn't some magical man in the sky who determines who gets what. That's a purely human process whereby people within a certain culture or society or nation decide what means they're going to use to determine which things can be owned or controlled and which people get to do it. There is simply no reason to believe that there is this big, independent, objective, determinable process of property control. We return to the idea that Locke somehow had this understanding of this, not that Locke had an idea for how we'd like to see such things work. It's an opinion. It's not demonstrable determination of objective truth.
Locke's theory states that people have a moral, objective right to themselves, to the property of themselves. He frames things in the context of property rights, because they have the ability to exert their will independent of other people. Now, he goes on to explain that as a result of this, what he frames as an axiom, he goes on to say that as a result, people gain a property right in things that they take out of the state of nature. So by taking natural resources and putting them to productive use, a form of wealth creation, they somehow obtain this natural property right. This was a belief I ascribed to a long time ago. For long-time readers of my blog, they'll remember a post I made in November that explains my own theory on this. And I'm going to explain today why I think this belief is bunk. And there's two main critiques I'm going to give to Locke's initial theory, which I don't think deviates too far from later the Rothbardian and Hoppian explanation for natural rights, as is held in libertarian circles today. I'm then going to transition back to the non-aggression principle and explain why I think there are ethical problems as a result of an inherently flawed ethical system.
Locke's opinion, and let's be very clear, this is just an opinion, is that people have a right to control themselves. Okay, for the most part, I can agree with that, although there are certainly times when people do not and cannot have control over themselves. If people violate the law, they are arrested, they are taken to jail, and they will serve whatever sentence society has seen fit to assign them, thus costing their bodily autonomy. Of course, we see him using the term axiom when referring to Locke's position, meaning that it's not something he thinks he can actually objectively or rationally defend. It's just something he's going to assert. Unfortunately, I don't accept his axiom. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the libertarian to actually defend this position, and I just don't think they can do it. I also question Locke's position that a person automatically gets ownership of anything they take out of the state of nature. I don't get to go get something that you own from a property that you have control over and call it my own because I took it out of a state of nature. It just doesn't work that way.
The first main flaw in Locke's understanding is the problem of antagonistic interests. And so while he states that people have a property right in themselves to make their own actions, and initially this is also the Kantian understanding of natural rights, which is also commonly held, both of them share this idea that freedom is an inherent natural right because people are able to exercise it. The problem is that in certain situations, things in the world will be desired by multiple people who have similar interests, and as a result, when one of them makes use of it and coercively prevents others from doing so, he has thereby infringed on the natural rights of all other people by exercising his own. It is necessarily the case that when multiple rights-bearing beings interact with one another, some rights will have to fall in order for others to be exercised, which results in rights contradiction.
While I appreciate that he has some problems with Locke's positions, the idea that people inherently have personal freedom because they have the ability to exercise personal freedom seems a bit circular and absurd. Ability does not grant permission. I have the ability to blow someone's full head off. That doesn't give me the right to do so. I have the ability to sneak onto someone's property and steal something. That doesn't give me the right to do so. As has been said, my right to swing my fist ends at my neighbor's nose. This whole idea that you can't stop others from using a thing or doing a thing utterly does away with the idea of intellectual property and copyright law. Yes, I know there are some libertarians who reject such things, but if you take natural objects and create something with them such that you own the intellectual property of that thing that you created, others don't get to come along and produce the idea that you own using natural objects and sell them at a cheaper price than you do. The idea that you own yourself and the fruits of your labor is part of a lot of libertarianism, but it seems to directly contradict the ideas of Locke and other philosophers.
And to explain this, consider the hypothetical example where a car somehow magically formed in the state of nature without anyone's work being exerted onto it. If I choose to make use of that car, even if I apply the typical libertarian set of ways, if I apply one of those ways to justly obtain that car, like if I homestead the car, I have still prevented all other people from being able to do the same thing. If I homestead the car, you can't homestead the car, he can't homestead the car, it's my car. The second main problem with Locke's understanding of natural rights is transitioning his axiom of ownership in oneself to ownership in things. And this is a pretty simple problem. The basic explanation being that his axiom simply doesn't carry over. If I have a natural right in myself as a result of me being able to exert my will, how it is that I have a natural right in things which have no will is an impossibility unless a second axiom is formed which has not been made. Some have gone so far as to explain that it is an extension of one's life when he takes things from the earth and transitions it into materials useful by people, but it just isn't the case. Those things objectively still don't have a will, and therefore, if we follow the logical conclusion of Locke's axiom, cannot be owned by anyone.
You don't have to use a car. You can use something that actually exists in nature. Gold is a relatively rare commodity in the real world. It often is difficult to mine in large quantities, and there is only a limited supply. If you take gold out of nature, you have automatically stopped other people from taking that same gold for their own use. This is true of every single natural resource in existence, although granted there are some that are quite common, and it might be very difficult to take away so much of it that it limits the rights of others to do so. This is really where we start getting into the silliness of philosophy, where the morality of owning things that have no agency is argued against. This is where philosophical concepts have really no application in the real world. I don't think you're going to convince anyone that owning anything, not food, not clothing, not shelter, absolutely anything that you can own or control, is somehow a moral or ethical wrong. I'm sorry, but if you cannot rationally apply philosophy to real-world situations, it just isn't particularly useful or worthwhile.
I'm now going to make the careful and important distinction between the ethics of natural rights and the concept of legal rights. And this is something that I think is very important for libertarians to understand. If I believe in a society that accepts a legal structure that is similar to those purported by those who believe in a non-aggression principle, an ethical understanding of natural rights, it could be that I support that same idea, that same law structure, for a different reason, for a different set of morals. I happen to be a utilitarian. I think utilitarianism is something that can be objectively determined and reasoned as a hardcore moral ethic that solves the Aesop problem. Natural rights does not. But the point is, we recognize that in either one of these cases, whatever your goal is, a society under that law best achieves that goal.
But does it? He continues to use words like belief, and those are faith words, not rational ones. I really don't care if you believe in natural rights if you cannot demonstrate that natural rights actually exist. Just like I don't care how much you have faith that you have religious rights if you cannot show that religious rights actually exist. We do know that society has legal rights. Those are rights that society has decided to codify into law that explains how, when, and where citizens and others actually have legal protection or responsibility under the law. These are, in fact, the only kind of rights we have actually shown that really exist in reality. I'm not at all impressed by people who say that they have this complete set of other rights over there that they cannot show are real, any more than I'm impressed by people who believe in intangible gods or talking to imaginary friends. That's really what this entire concept of natural rights comes down to.
But the point is, we recognize that in either one of these cases, whatever your goal is, a society under that law best achieves that goal. But this is why I'm still a libertarian. This is why, despite the fact that I don't think the universe gets offended in and of itself whenever one of these principles is broken, I do believe that when society is structured in a libertarian fashion, it is overall more likely to be prosperous. It is a better society than the many forms of dictatorship and always has been throughout history. But that's not the same thing as saying that ethics are exactly equal to abiding by this law. Imagine a hypothetical scenario where an asteroid is about to hit the Earth and kill all of life. And you can prevent it by stealing an item from your neighbor that is worth 1 nickel. Do you steal the item? And by a strict adherence to the non-aggression principle, the answer would have to be no. You should, as Kant famously stated, do what is right though the world should perish. You should not take the item because it inherently violates the moral law of natural rights. But in reality, I think very few natural rights theorists are unwilling to take the item. And the reason is because we all recognize on some level that really the preference for welfare that humans have, the welfare of sentient beings, is the thing that matters. And this is something I explain in the concept of my book In Progress, Foundation of Man, which surely all of you are going to buy.
Clearly, the universe doesn't get offended. The universe is not a sentient entity. Quite often you get libertarians making the claim that these supposed natural rights are just floating around out there in the ether, that they've always existed and have always been there waiting for man to pop up so they could apply to humanity, and this is quite absurd. And no, if your book is as absurd as your video, I'm not going to buy it. It's just a bunch of unsupported claims about concepts that you cannot demonstrate, but that you assert are true because reasons. And while there may be some good ideas in libertarianism, and of course he's welcome to think that his political and ethical views are superior, it only matters what he can actually show to be true. There can be no moral law of natural rights if natural rights are just a bald assertion without any application to the real world.
The only thing human beings have preference in is their welfare as determined by how they value differing sorts of emotions. And being that that is the only preference they hold, it is the only standard by which we can adhere and the only context with which we can think, you could say this doesn't really matter. We're still all libertarians, we're still all supporting the same thing. Why does it matter if you think we should have it for this reason and I think we should have it for another? And on some level, that argument holds weight. I've been heavily influenced by a very large number of natural rights theorists. Rothbard, perhaps the most notable example, also Hoppe, also Bloch, all of them agree with exactly what I've just refuted. And by the way, as a side note, if it happens that one of the viewers of this video is a natural rights theorist and would like to propose another argument that I haven't considered, or would like to refute my refutations, please, I'm more than happy if you do so. But at the same time, I agree with them because, like I was stating earlier, the economic arguments that they make, and they are all very influential economists. Is Rothbard right on natural rights? No, I don't think so. Is Rothbard ever wrong on an economic subject? Not really, no.
Wrong. Humans are programmed by their genes to value survival of themselves, their offspring, and the species as a whole. That's something we've been given by evolution, and even though we've developed a rational mind which is capable of overriding these biological impulses, that doesn't make the impulses vanish. Whether or not we've been influenced by the thinking of a lot of philosophers is largely irrelevant. It really only matters, if we're willing to be honest, whether these ideas have any use in the real world. Let's be honest. There are a lot of people who have been totally screwed up by philosophies that mean nothing in reality. They spend all their time noodling their navels because these ideas are totally useless. People who are into antinatalism, people who are contemplating various kinds of solipsism. There are no end to philosophical ideas that do a whole lot of thinking and not a whole lot of doing. Plus, how can anyone refute anything you've said because you've never actually presented anything but your own personal opinions? You've never supported them with any kind of reason or evidence and seemingly aren't bothered by your inability to do so. This brings me to a major problem with a lot of modern philosophical thought, that it really doesn't do more than try to spin the philosopher's axiomatic opinions and positions into something that you can fast talk others of like mind into. As I said earlier, an axiom is something that is believed to be self-evidently true. I reject the idea of natural rights being self-evident. In any kind of rational debate, axioms are only permitted when they cannot be refuted because the act of refutation requires that the axiom itself be used as a premise. However, So many philosophers, many of them the armchair variety, simply declare their pre-existing opinions to be axioms and refuse to even evaluate them or allow their opponents to address them. They're true because the philosopher wants them to be true, not because they can be demonstrated to be true. In that, a lot of modern philosophy becomes circular. They assume the axiom is true, then they build upon that undemonstrated axiom such that they try to construct an argument that proves that the original axiom is true. It's ultimately pointless, and I think that libertarianism has fallen directly into that trap. There is no reason to think natural rights exist. There's no evidence for them. No libertarian can explain how they are real. They cannot show that they would start from a truly neutral position, examine the evidence that exists, and come to a conclusion that natural rights actually exist. They can't tell how they determine which natural rights exist and which ones do not. It's all a bunch of hand-wavium and no actual intellectual work. We know that societies construct rights and codify them into law. We know that those rights are fluid and subjective. They vary from place to place and across time. Once, blacks had few, if any, rights in America. Today, they do. The libertarians do much like the religious. They demand that these rights exist, have always existed, and will always exist, and anyone who doesn't accept the things that they have to say must be doing it wrong. Unfortunately, they can demonstrate none of these things, any more than the religious can demonstrate that some God hands down commandments from on high. Any political, social, or religious group that makes pronouncements but can't back them up isn't operating rationally. They're just putting forth wishful thinking. And there you have it. Please respond below with comments, questions, or constructive criticisms. If you have any evidence for these rights, let me know. I'd love to debate the subject. But in every single debate I've ever had with a libertarian, they just keep repeating the same old tired mantra over and over and over again. Surely you libertarians can do better than that. Like and subscribe and help me spread the word of rationality and intelligence in a world of hyper-emotionalism and blind faith. It's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it.